members of this society, and we're integrated into it, we're socialized into it. How is it that this social thing can stay alive when all the people at the beginning are dead? They're no longer here. And so his question is really one about continuity. How does society keep going? And he assumes a couple things in thinking about society. First, he assumes that society is vulnerable. Vulnerable. All right, here we go. In other words, that stuff can happen externally, internally, to individuals, whatever. That things can happen that makes society precarious or could make it so society could potentially fall apart. Another key choice for, a key theoretical point for Berger is a point about humans. And he sees humans, and this is really important, as meaning-needing and meaning-making creatures, okay? So Berger's writing in the 1960s when we have this kind of upshot of psychological and biological work that starts to kind of look at the biological mechanisms of humans to try and explain life. And we have that going on again now here in the 21st century. We have this real rise in evolutionary psychology that basically always tries to look at biological mechanisms to explain why it is that humans are a certain way. But Berger's saying, no, resist that, because what's very important, and Berger goes on to show it in his book, is that humans have this ongoing creative need and capacity to make sense of their own lives as well as the social world in order that our lives and our world can keep going. So in other words, in order so that there is order, so that things stick together, things hang together. Now it's important when we think about Peter Berger's argument is he's not saying that people are walking around saying, oh, I've got to come up with some sort of meaning to understand this situation. It's much more kind of subconscious or ingrained in us than that. So that example I gave you of the breakup, most people are going to walk up to somebody who's gone through a breakup and say, oh, I'm really sorry to hear about that. He, she wasn't good enough for you. You'll find a better partner. And that's a good example in Berger's sense of that this meaning-making activity just kind of happens. It's part of who we are and what we do. So it's not like a conscious duping or anything like that. I want to move us away from that kind of pejorative sense of thinking about religion or meaning-making. Now, something else that Berger tends to do is say that basically meaning varies by society. So this comes as no surprise to you, especially if you had a sociology class before, that societies are different. And for Berger, he tends to say in his argument, well, we can understand meaning systems by looking at the activity of the society that it's connected to. So he tends to think in kind of blocks of societies. And usually, in a lot of people that use Peter Berger, they often think in terms of national level societies. So that's an important point, is that the meaning system is part and parcel or equal to the social system. They ride along together. It's not like there's one meaning system for the whole world. Instead, it has to do with the more coherent social groupings of the world. Those usually being nations, countries, but then oftentimes when you break it down to, say, communities, or even to a very small, lowest level, especially for this class, congregations or religious groups. Let's see here. And then attached with these various societies is that these societies, historically, according to Berger, tend to be kind of separated. So just as a society was separate from another society, the meaning-making of one society was separate from the meaning-making system of another society. So this is kind of the world of humans and society that Berger lays out. And then he comes back again to his key question, which is, how is it that society keeps together and reoccurs over time? Or how is it that meaning continues to be produced over time and keeps society together? And he comes up with some interesting answers, which you'll already have read for today. But let me recap them really quick. A couple of things. He talks about the process of socialization, as we've talked about before. That's no surprise. He has a very detailed idea of how this process occurs. He talks about over time how what is important to humans is externalized and then it becomes a taken for granted in our social world. It's objectified, and then over time it's internalized. So a good example of this is the Constitution of the United States. In 1788 there was none, but in 1789 there was one. And after that time going forward, people begin to refer to that document. That document takes on a life of its own. It becomes kind of this long-standing tradition, so that when we're born, there's a constitution, no biggie, no surprise to us. And the rights and the language of that constitution is then internalized into us. So Berger has a sense of how society, it begins at a certain point, but it has these processes so that people who drop into it, like you and I, can become a part of it. And religions are classic examples of this, right? With the various rituals and activities that any religious group will have, will pick somebody up from the moment they drop into the group and bring somebody in and socialize them into that group. Another key thing for Berger is he says for meaning making to keep happening, so basically within this process of socialization, there are things like culture, and very importantly, language. So culture being all those kind of ideas, and ways of talking to each other, and core meanings and concepts in a culture. And these are expressed by language. So for Berger, language is incredibly important. The fact that we talk together is what keeps us together in Berger's mind. And this makes some maybe natural sense, or we could say it resonates with you and I, right? Because it's often when we talk to a good friend, or we talk to a partner, or a family, now that might take us off sometimes, but it's also that which keeps us engaged in that relationship, right? There's no better way to get rid of a relationship than to not talk. But if this talking is kind of an ongoing activity, then it keeps a social group, either a relationship or a society, together over time. And so Berger has a couple of really cool quotes about this that I wanted to point out. On page 17 in your reading, Berger says, "The world is maintained as a subjective reality by conversation, be it with the same person or with new significant others. If such conversation is disrupted, for example, the spouse dies, the friends disappear, or one comes to leave one's original social location, the world begins to totter. It loses its subjective plausibility, or in other words, it loses its believability that feels very commonsensual to us. In other words, the subjective reality of the world hangs on the thin thread of conversation." So let me try and diagram for you what Berger's saying. So what he's saying is, if we've got you, we've got your friend, and you guys do talk, 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 then the world, and in Peter Berger's sense, the ability of the world to hang together starts with the ability of small groupings to hang together. If this talk, 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 if it ends, something happens, somebody dies, this person moves away, this sort of stuff, then the world totters. Clearly this relationship ends, but what happens, and this is back of Berger's head, what happens if this were to happen on a social-wide level? Is it possible that society would just kind of peter out and fall apart? Let me point you toward another important quote from Berger. He says, talking about society, in other words, to live in the social world is to live an ordered and meaningful life, okay, which I've already talked about. He writes, "Society is the guardian of order and meaning, not only objectively in its institutional structures, but subjectively as well in its structuring of individual consciousness." So what he's saying is, to use maybe our Constitution